All right, I'm here with David and Xray. Hey guys.
Hey,
Live
how's it
long and
going?
prosper.
So let's start with a little bit about yourselves.
Well, my name is David Santiago, and I am currently a principal technical artist at Insomniac Games. Originally, I was an electrical engineer working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for NASA, but after a few years, I got into the visual effects industry, worked on a lot of feature films, commercials, music videos, animated films, and then I found my home in video games about 8 years ago at Insomniac Games, and been here ever since. I started on Sunset Overdrive, worked on the Spider-Man games, and now most recently Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart.
Very cool. What about you, Xray?
Hi, my name is Xray Halperin. I'm a senior technical artist at Insomniac Games. I focus on procedural systems, primarily using Houdini as a framework. I got my start in visual effects back when Houdini was just prisms. I was able to work with David on several projects at Digital Domain while working in feature film visual effects. And I joined Insomniac about 5 years ago. It's been a great ride and I'm really enjoying it. Today I'll be talking about the procedural systems for Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales.
And I'll be talking about some of the procedural systems we use for production of Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart.
Looking forward to it. Let's jump in.
Greetings, my name is David Santiago, and I am a principal technical artist at Insomniac Games. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the procedural systems we use to make the PS5 exclusive game Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. This is just a brief opening act talk before Xray's more in-depth presentation about some of the procedural systems used on Spider-Man Miles Morales. Of course, some of those systems were used on Ratchet and Clank as well. The emphasis of my talk is that simple procedural tools can have a large impact on a project for many areas of production. So what could these simple tools be? You need to look at all the small tasks that people do from day to day. What content will be authored and re-authored? What are the time-consuming and repetitive or iterative tasks? Is there anything that needs optimization or validation that can be defined systematically? Technical or not, all of those tasks are prime for procedural systems to do the busy work normally associated with them. Ratchet and Clank games have a very organic and experimental development process. In production, we used multiple procedural systems we already had in our tools library and developed some new ones. This is not a complete list of the procedural systems used, just a few that had a major impact. Our grind rail generation was aided by a spline to model tool. A traffic authoring system was created specific to Ratchet and Clank's needs. Our regular imposter system was upgraded to work on multiple open worlds and generate imposters for assets that never stream in. And we created a way to author content globally and then distribute to the assets into the appropriate open world streaming regions. So let's start with the spline to model tool. What was the plan for this thing? Well, it was initially just a simple tool to sweep geometry along a curve to help the artists and designers create grind rails. That's something they do over and over again. It's a very iterative development process, and if you have to model it by hand, or even jump into another package to update the rail, that eats up a lot of time. This system lets them author and re-author gameplay grind curves in the Insomniac level editor and then generates the new models by selecting the curve or curves and running the generation command from a menu. The simple HDA sweeps geometry onto the curves, exports the model, and adds it to the level. This relatively very simple tool takes an all-day task into just 5 minutes of work. Here's part of the interface in the Insomniac level editor. These properties are associated with a curve. When submitted for generation, the properties become attributes in Houdini, defining the content to generate in background Python process. You can see how these properties could be parameters on an HDA, and most of them are. But once I realized no one will be authoring this content from a Houdini session, there was no reason to add parameters to the HDA. The Python-based importer dynamically creates attributes for the properties added in the editor. That means if I added a second UV set to this property panel, it would automatically be added as an attribute when generating the model. Lower down on the same panel, you can see there is the ability to add a second UV set, and there are some additional controls for collision, LODs, and actor properties. There is also a dynamic array added to add multiple instance objects in many ways. One can actually place a collection or library of possible assets that can be randomly or sequentially chosen for placement. For example, if you wanted to place trees, you could have a whole library of trees placed along the curve based on placement parameters. This is one of the very first examples I used to demonstrate the spline to model tool. I generate a 3D path model along that green curve and also instance several asset types along the curve, such as the box that's offset to the left, a character randomly along the path, and some drones from the Spider-Man game. This example uses many features of the original version of the tool. I created a path through Central Park. From this vantage point, we see that I added a collection of different trees for instancing along a curve. If we look inside of the woods, we see there is a paved path along which we have these headless NPC characters, since heads are chosen at runtime. There is also additional vegetation on either side of the path besides the trees that we could see from above. This particular wooded path through Central Park took a minute for me to set up and generate. As I mentioned before, once this tool was out there, the artists and designers came up with all sorts of different ways to use it. One artist authored these off-ramps for Spider-Man Miles Morales just by using a freeway model cross-section on curves leading to the bridge. The tool was used for a lot of design experimentation to make simple models or instance gameplay and design primitives, such as these design capsule cylinders and spheres. One artist decided to use it for procedurally placing vegetation along the edges of areas in Ratchet and Clank. And here's another example that places rocks and vegetation along a stream. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart has some big cities, so some initial layout used the tool to instance buildings. Here's an iteration that mocked up the parade route in the beginning of the game and then populated a city around the route. And then here's a second version. And each of these iterations took seconds to generate from the layout curves. And as was originally intended, here is an example of one of the many grind rails in Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. The tool also created the special collision geometry in these glitch challenges. These little combat arenas required special surface and bounding collision that's not present in any visible environment geometry. Spline to model was used heavily over many iterations of the challenges, and I only recently found out that it was used much more than I thought. In this frame from Spider-Man Miles Morales, artist Oscar Gonzalez uses it to create all the different cables, from the purely environmental ones in the ceiling to the gameplay-related cables going to that generator on the stage in the Opera House. Again, since many of the cables were gameplay-related with markup, many iterations were required as the design for the mission evolved. That's the last example I have for the Spline to Model tool, although it was used for many other things. Now there is quite a bit of vehicle traffic in various cities of Ratchet and Clank, so we needed an easy way to author and reauthor it. Again, curves in the editor are given specific traffic properties from which the traffic nodes and markup are generated for the runtime system. The system was much simpler than the traffic system created for Spider-Man or that was upgraded for Spider-Man Miles Morales, but because of the density, speed, and scale of the traffic flying through the air, some different properties were required. The system simply had to instance and optimize density of traffic nodes along those curves and apply the correct properties to each of those nodes for the gameplay code to process. The number of iterations and adjustments made during production is just not possible any other way. Now here's the traffic system in action. The last tool I'm going to talk about is actually a major production development for authoring streaming regions from globally authored content. We let artists and designers author their content in large zones, pretty much as they had done on previous Ratchet and Clank games. But because of these much larger worlds, the open world experience we wanted, and going back and forth between the rifts, we not only stream regions of a single open world, but between multiple open worlds. Here's an example of an open world map for one of the areas of Ratchet and Clank. Each tile represents a streaming region, each of which contains zones for art, gameplay, lighting, audio, effects, etc. The open world system loads in the high-resolution geometry, lighting, audio, and gameplay for the tiles around the player. All the other tiles remain in low-resolution representations, such as imposters with distant lighting data. The system automatically sets up the open world region per planet based on its content, streaming the lighting, gameplay, art, and effect zones. The art instances are moved to the streaming art zones. Large models are cut into smaller models with LODs and placed into those streaming art zones. Sometimes much smaller models are needed to support gameplay physics. Gameplay elements are moved to the streaming gameplay zones, checkpoints, crates, covers, etc. Background environmental pieces are moved to background streaming regions, so only imposters are ever used in the game. Multi-region elements of art and gameplay are moved to open world global regions, which are always loaded when that level is loaded. Here's an example, falling through a rift, going from one open world to another. This procedural system was the most complex used on Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, but the greatest impact on game production was from our set of smaller procedural tools. And that's all I have. Thank you very much. If there are any quick questions, feel free to contact us at Insomniac Games.
My name is Xray Halperin, and for Spider-Man Miles Morales, I created several procedural systems to enhance the game. The open-world environment of Spider-Man Miles Morales is divided into 735 tile regions. Each tile region is defined by several zone files, which are JSON that contain references to the assets within a given game. In many workflows, each tile may be expressed as a work item in Houdini's procedural dependency graph. We don't translate the tile names to world space. There's no semantic for that. There's no encoding. It's just for humans to read. The first step in most of the Insomniac Games procedural workflows is to construct a point cloud from the zone data. Python scripts parse JSON from the zone files and recurse through all the references. By loading the game data into Houdini as a point cloud with attributes and flattening the transformations into world space, I can begin to reason about the game content. Point cloud data like this is also useful for generating audits. It's good for finding things like a small garden plant model with no LOD that's used 24,300 times. When I need the model assets, I can instance pack geometry onto the point cloud. It's memory efficient when the assets are built from repeated model instances. This is an incomplete list of procedural systems for Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. It includes things like placing snow around the city, adding holiday decorations to buildings, adjusting geometry vertex color to drive material blends, adding navigation clues to the open world, generating imposter meshes, and counting assets and their attributes for auditing purposes. Spider-Man was set in the fall, while Spider-Man Miles Morales is set in winter. I used several procedural systems to winterize Marvel's Manhattan. Most of the objects in this Houdini network represent various workflows used to generate procedural content for Spider-Man Miles Morales. Snow was added to the open world using procedural systems. I measured the curbs and placed snow mounds on reasonable metrics while avoiding driveways and corners. Vertex colors were added to the ground to drive shader components like linear or omnidirectional blending and sidewalk icing. A similar system placed snow mounds on the lane lines. The road and curb snow are prefabs made of several model instances and built to metrics of 2 meters, 4 meters, 8 meters, and 16 meters. The final assets are gathered in a collection displayed here in the Insomniac Asset Vault. In this visualization, we'll look at a single tile in Greenwich called M35. M35 is a typical streaming tile made up of some street-level terrain with various streets and sidewalks, as well as some mid-rise buildings. Here's the data as it appears in the orbit level editor. First, I isolate the terrain. Next, I isolate the edges of curbs, and in the case of street lanes, and lane lines. I trim the isolated curves back a bit from the corners to keep things from piling up on the accessibility ramps. Next, I trim away areas near driveways or subway entrances. After measuring the resulting curves, I procedurally select appropriate elements from the collection and instance them along the curves. I use a similar system to add snow skirts around the bases of the buildings. The red spheres indicate the centroids of each line segment. I instance the different snow assets from the collection as appropriate, matching the metrics of line length to the centroid of each segment, and align them lengthwise. Looking at the level editor again, note the snow assets added to the streaming region. Holiday decorations were added to Marvel's Manhattan in a similar fashion. For example, a collection of holiday lights for various window models was hand-modeled and added to a collection. Matching the model instance names with a set of lights in the collection and picking a variant allows for procedural placement of the assets onto each candidate building. In this image, the window lights are not isolated to the single tile, so many appear floating in space. However, these belong to buildings in neighboring tiles. Vertex colors on geometry are used to drive materials and material blending. The vertex colors are visible in this GL rendering of the geometry color attributes. The red color on the sidewalks indicates where ice builds up around pedestrian paths. The yellow and green are similar blends for icy asphalt. The alpha blend at the intersection controls the directionality of the ice streaks from the road to the intersection. This video displays a tight integration between Houdini and the Insomniac level editor. Houdini on the left and the orbit level editor on the right. Keep your eye on the intersection on the right. Note that the pattern in the intersection is omnidirectional. The streets leading up to it have some directionality caused by traffic direction. As the ground geometry with painted vertex colors is saved out to disk, the binary beta is built on the fly and ingested directly into the level editor. The video has been sped up a little bit to avoid the feeling of watching paint dry. Spider-Man Miles Morales introduces a new enemy, the Underground. These tech-powered foes jump from rooftop to rooftop, chasing Spider-Man with 3D pathfinding assisted by navigation clue markup procedurally generated in Houdini. I choose a combination of the edge markup and roof geometry to translate possible nav clues for valid jumps from roof to roof using some baseline heuristics such as vertical and horizontal minimum and maximum distance, and maximum angle using a dot product. Here's the data as it appears in the orbit level editor. First, I extract the ledge markup. I extract the roofs and building footprints. I propagate potential candidate paths. Finally, I cull the candidate paths using additional heuristics such as distance, a ray test for collision along a path, if a nearby roof is directly above a landing point, there are separate rules for paths that go from roof to roof in the same building versus those that cross over a street or alley. Additional rules control ground to roof navigation clues. Here are the final nav clues in the level editor in purple. While the lines connecting the start and ending points make it look like some of the navigation clues are penetrating walls, there is a midpoint helper volume that allows the underground enemies to jump in an arc-like fashion. I lather, rinse, and repeat using PDG for all of the streaming tile regions in the open world. The buildings are templated, and the magenta and cyan line segments represent all of the navigation clues. The IG-Impostor system uses full 3D meshes rather than 2D billboards to represent distant geometry. Every building in this image is an IG-Impostor. Imposters represent the lowest LOD in the game. They never stream out of global resident memory. Imposters provide a fallback when high-res assets stream out of memory. We use imposters for several game systems, such as cascaded shadow maps, ray tracing, and environment probes. The memory footprint of the geometry assets for Manhattan in Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales is about 100 megabytes. The lowest MIP of imposter textures takes up about 400 megabytes. Let's look at another building from Spider-Man's open world. This is from tile H21. The building's name is H21 Fancy Brick 0x900CB798BE9D C82D _ mod. This exploded view shows all the model instances that make up the building. Buildings are constructed from model kits containing predefined assets such as windows, walls, and doors. Since the prefabricated building assets are used over and over within a building, there are a small number of unique models used per building. In this case, only 76 unique model instances. Here is the full resolution LOD of the building. There are about 150,000 polygons and 1,600 model instances. Here's the full resolution lowest LOD of the building. It's got about 90,000 polygons. In order to generate the IG-Impostor, I identify groups of connected geometry which shares a primitive normal. I iterate over each set of connected geometry which shares the common primitive normal. I remove shared edges from the polygons, leaving an outline of the shape. I iterate over each group of primitives which share normals and connected edges. Then I assemble them back into a single mesh for the entire building. I remove the occluded polygons, resulting in a final imposter mesh with about 5,000 triangles, having started with over 90,000 polygons. I capture the imposter geometry and generate orthogonal texture atlas images in the Insomniac engine. This is the RGB albedo atlas, the spec gloss and emission atlas, and a combined texture atlas for all of the imposters in a streaming region. Here are some examples of imposter regions composed of multiple streaming regions. Thank you very much for your time.